Hello, and welcome to the Tavern. This episode was a long time in the making after we recorded. It took a lot of time to edit. As you can see, we're way over our normal recording time, and on top of that, there were a lot of audio issues that popped up. There was a lot of clipping, and as you can tell, I popped my peas a lot. Hopefully I was able to fix a lot of that. There was also some Skype lag that caused us to talk over one another a lot more than normal. I really apologize for all the audio issues. I fixed as much as I could, but I'm a mortal, man. There's only so much that can be done. But honestly, the content in this episode goes way beyond any sort of audio issues that might come up. We have with us legendary game designer Keith Baker, who is joining us to talk about how to run your games and make them even more awesome. So grab a drink and try to keep the volume a little bit lower than normal. And we'll be right back after this word from our sponsor. Hello gamers, I'm Daryl Mott Jr. from Anacle News Tabletop and the Gamers Tavern podcast, which you probably know because I'm betting I was just talking a second ago. I'm sure you already know about DriveThruRPG, as it is the biggest repository for digital copies of your favorite games. Dungeons & Dragons, Shadowrun, Battletech, World of Darkness, Numenera, Fate, and so many more. And sometimes there are pennies on the dollar because, face it, PDFs can sometimes be so much more convenient than print copies, but if you need print copies, they sell those too. So if you want to support the Gamers Tavern podcast, click on the affiliate links in the show notes and check out DriveThruRPG.
Hello and welcome to the Gamers Tavern, episode 9. Wow, it's really hard to believe we've done 9 episodes so far. I'm Ross Watson.
And I'm Daryl Mott.
And tonight we've got with us Keith Baker.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Tonight we're going to talk about tips and simple tricks you can use to improve your game mastering. But first we want to ask Keith what we ask all of our guests on the show. Keith, can you tell us a little bit about your gamer character sheet?
Certainly. I suppose my primary class would be role-playing game designer. Most people know me for the campaign setting of Eberron for Dungeons & Dragons, and that's something I created back in 2003. I've also written 6...
Warforged.
Yes, Warforged. I've also written 6 of the novels from the Eberron setting and a whole pile of the source books. However, in addition to that, I've made a card game called Gloom, that has been doing very well. We just had a new expansion for Gloom come out called Unquiet Dead. And I also have done sundry work on many other role-playing games from, Feng Shui, Over the Edge, all kinds of odds and ends. Currently, I'm working on a new role-playing game called Phoenix 9 Deaths. And that's something that will be crowdfunding early next year. But you can find out more information at my website, keith-baker.com.
Well, that sounds pretty interesting. And I have to say, first of all, I'm a big fan of your work. I really like Eberron. I'm also the player of Feng Shui. We've talked about that a little bit before. And we talked about Gloom actually quite a bit back in episode 8 with Nicole Wakelin.
Mm-hmm.
And Gloom is an award-winning card game that apparently has a lot of people interested in. I mean, Total Fangirl.
Brilliant design on those cards, those
clear
cards and everything. I love it. The art style and just the gameplay is a hell of a lot of fun. It was just a blast.
Yeah, the overall design of it got quite a bit of a good reception in the last episode for sure.
Well, I'm glad to hear it. I'm certainly... Gloom is one of the things I've done that I'm probably proudest of just because, I came up with the idea from scratch, put it together in my basement, and now it's out there in the world. So I feel pretty good about Gloom.
Awesome. So let's take a moment and talk about what we've been playing lately. Daryl, what have you been playing lately?
Unfortunately, I have had absolutely no time for gaming recently because this past week before we recorded, I edited that massive Shadowrun episode 7 that we did, and that was a beast to edit.
It was a big episode.
Yeah, it was almost 2 hours total. Oh man, it was a blast though, and a great episode. It's the first one I've actually listened to again after I edited it, because it was just so fascinating to me. But beyond that, I hosted a panel for EtherCon, which is an online virtual convention that happens. By the time this airs, will be about 2 weeks ago. All those panels are online streaming, except for I think mine got lost in, ironically, the ether, because of a software crash. But
what was your panel about?
It was Immersion Studios, which is an independent game company based out of Australia.
Cool.
Oh,
nice.
Okay.
That's doing this cool sort of trying to build like a generic role-playing system with all these different settings that layer onto it that can kind of mix and match. A little bit GURPSy, but a little more tightly organized than that in terms of they have, here's this campaign setting, here's this campaign setting, here's this campaign setting. It's just all the bits and pieces are all interchangeable.
Cool.
So you can take a race from this one and put it into this one. It was really fascinating to hear about, but you can find them online as well if you're curious about them. And then, of course, I stayed for the Catalyst Game Labs Q&A that happened directly after mine. But yeah, I haven't got a chance to game because the day job has been sucking up a lot of my time, but that's not a problem this week or from now on because I got a new day job.
Congrats.
So I am taking a week off to catch up on the podcast, catch up on my column, and get some gaming done. I've got a stack of stuff I need to get through. So I'm really looking forward to this week, and I am really looking forward to having weekends off so I can have a regular game night again. Finally.
What about you, Keith? What have you been playing lately?
Well, largely I've been playing a whole lot of Phoenix because we are deeply in playtesting right now. And so I have a number of groups that I'm running with Phoenix, and we're going to be getting outside Gamemaster soon just to see how it works when you don't have a Keith in the box. So I'm really enjoying that. And beyond that, I actually just played my first game of D&D Next for quite a while on Saturday. A friend of mine is starting up an Eberron campaign, and, hard for me to pass up a chance to get to play an Eberron. So I made a Changeling Rogue.
Running a game... Dude, running the game for the guy who wrote the setting, that takes some balls.
It's pretty entertaining, although he is moving the setting forward a decade or so we're able to sort of discuss what might have happened, and, it's a little different from my personal Eberron, and that kind of works well. And beyond that, in terms of other kinds of games, I've also been playing a lot of Takedo recently, and enjoying that.
That's the bamboo-eating panda garden game, isn't it?
No, that's a different one, I think. Takedo is by, I want to say it's
I'm thinking of Takanoko.
And, and Takedo is basically about taking a trip along a road. And as you go, you stop at hot springs, and
that's the Japanese tourist game.
It's the Japanese tourist game, absolutely, and but it's a relatively quick game. It's certainly very attractive to look at, and it's one of those ones where there's some strategy to it, but you can't plan too far ahead. The actions of the other players definitely, have a big impact on the choices you make on your next turn. So it's interesting. I like it.
So Keith, if you could just give us a elevator pitch for Phoenix and tell us what it's about. What is Phoenix about?
So Phoenix is a card-based role-playing game, and the short form of it is that it's a fantasy world in which you are basically elite military forces trying to defend this empire, and everything is going to hell. There's just a massive outbreak of pretty much any kind of supernatural threat you can think of. It's going on somewhere in the empire. And they are throwing you at whatever problem comes up. And odds are good that you're going in without enough information. You're probably out of your depth, and you're probably going to die. But the good news is that because you are a phoenix, when you die, you actually come back stronger than before. The trick is that you only get to come back 8 times. And so it is a game in which death actually is the character advancement mechanism. That basically it is when you die, based on the nature of your death, determines what lessons you learn and essentially how you improve in your next life. It lets us do a number of interesting sort of things. The example I like to give is a sort of concrete sort of thing is you can say throw people into the mines of Moria and hey, you can fight orcs, that's great, and then you run into a Balrog and there is just no frickin' way your group can handle that Balrog. And you can stay there and all die, or, someone can hold the bridge and go down with it. And
level up.
To me, right, and level up. But that's sort of the point to me is it's a game in which we can have that situation, and for the person who makes that sacrifice and stays behind, the story isn't over. They can make the sacrifice, and it has meaning. As I said, you only get, 8 more lives, and further, you don't come back right away. You don't come back at the point at which you died. So one of the things is it allows us to have scenarios where you can fail and the story isn't over. If you get dropped in a village that's having a zombie outbreak and you stop it, great. If you fail to stop it and you all die, well, you'll all come back, but by the time you come back, it's too late to contain it, and we're going to have to, burn that entire region. And that will have long-term consequences in the campaign. So basically, sort of the point to me is it is a thing that lets death be a part of a story. It's not the end, but it's a thing that can have consequences, and we can explore those consequences.
That sounds really cool, but I do have a question for you. You said it was card-based. Does that mean there's no dice?
That means there's no dice. And one of the points of that is that a lot of the choices, I'm not going to get too deep into the mechanics here, but essentially you can always choose to make an attack successful, or almost always, if you are willing to basically put in the resources to do it. And a lot of what it comes down to is what are you willing to do in order to succeed? Is this a time when it is worth it to invest, your sparks, your willpower, because you only have so much before you're going to die?
That's a bold move, sir. A very bold move.
Well, it creates a different sort of experience. And to me, that's the last project I was working on was a new setting, and that's something I still have on the back burner, but I don't know when I'll get back to it. And the point there was, as a setting, I wasn't creating a new system because it didn't need a new system. There was no reason not to play it with Fate or D&D or whatever you liked. With Phoenix, we're making a new system because it is something where the system concretely supports the kind of story it is. It's a system designed for a very specific type of story, as opposed to something like Eberron, which is intentionally designed so you can do Raiders of the Lost Ark, you can do the Maltese Falcon, you can do a very wide range of stories. Phoenix is something where it's a very focused sort of type of story we're doing, and the system supports that. I should say I'm also working with a co-designer. His name is Dan Garrison, and he is a brilliant, awesome guy, though this is his first professional project. So, but anyhow.
No, that's a really interesting, choice that you made there, because when I was working on Accursed, which is the setting I came up with this year for Savage Worlds, we got together, the creators, and we discussed whether we wanted to make a new system for it or not, and we came to the same conclusion that you did, that if you want to tell like a bunch of different types of stories and leave it open, there's no reason not to use an existing system. But if you want to tell a very specific type of story and use specific mechanics to achieve those goals, that's when we decided that's something we would want to do with a different idea.
And that's very much with Codex, the other project, the setting I was talking about. One of the things I was considering was actually actively suggesting that people should potentially change systems between sessions. That basically use the system that really fits the kind of story, just because, A, there's so many good systems out there, but, many systems are particularly good at, this system's better at intrigue than at fighting. This system's better at fighting than at social interaction. Sort of what is this story about and which system is going to capture that best. So I was sort of playing around with that as a suggestion. But as I said, when it comes to Phoenix, the system we're developing really does do a lot of interesting things with the kind of story we're telling, and it makes it a very different experience.
One thing for sure, no one can accuse Keith Baker of not being innovative. Suggesting that we change systems between sessions would be like, what? that is definitely an idea I've never heard before.
I was just going to say, you can also look at Phoenix as a thing where it is also a card game in which we expect your characters to die. So, you can look at it as a cross between Gloom and Eberron.
Yeah, if anyone else made the claims you were making, I would laugh in their face, but if anyone's going to be able to pull it off, it's going to be you.
Oh, I was going to say, I'm doing a lot of playtesting right now, and as I say, we'll hopefully be crowdfunding, I would say, hopefully March, we'll see. Basically, we're definitely not going to do any kind of crowdfunding until we're 100% sure of cost, production schedule, all of that sort of thing. So for now, we're just continuing to hone the system and continue to test.
Cool. What I've been playing lately, I have gotten a chance to get together with a guy and play some miniature games that I have very rarely played, like Battlefleet Gothic is one of my favorite miniature games. Mm-hmm. And we've been playing quite a bit of that down at the local store. I'm running my Accursed playtest still on every weekend, and my group...
Excellent.
My group is doing some very interesting things coming up this week. They're going to be assaulting an airship, mounting experimental weaponry to ensure that the Accursed are not wiped out in the nation of Manrea. So good luck to them on that.
I was about to say airship and everything. Sure you're not playing Eberron?
Well, of course, one of my favorite elements of Eberron is Droam, which is the nation of monsters. I have an adventure I've run quite a lot that is people as a group of adventurers from Droam. So I appreciate the idea, is all I'm saying.
It's cool. I think you'd like it. Definitely check it out at accursedrpg.com, and we have a Kickstarter page. You can look at all of our really cool art. And we're going to be releasing Accursed for sale in mid-December is the plan. So
cool.
It'll very shortly be ready. I've been doing all the art direction and the overall development, and we're really excited about it. But I'm not here to talk about Accursed, so I'm going to keep that to a minimum. Just say that in addition to the things I just mentioned, I've also been playing Baldur's Gate Enhanced Edition. Just came out with the Baldur's Gate 2 collection, which includes not just Baldur's Gate 2, but also the expansion Throne of Vale. And it includes all the new characters and all the new updates, and I just adore Baldur's Gate. I'm one of the biggest fans in the world of that. And it is such a blast to play that game again, and to play it with all the new little tweaks and graphical improvements, and better. There's more encounters, there's more characters to talk to. It just took an already great game and made it better.
I have to say that Torment was always one of my favorite computer role-playing games of all time. So I'm excited to see where they're going with the Numenera Torment.
Oh yeah, Planescape Torment is definitely, in my opinion, the best video game role-playing game experience you can possibly have. But I'm somewhat biased, and I'm going to go ahead and just say that's a very subjective opinion.
Oh, I agree with you. So,
you're not the only one that holds that one. There's a lot of people that say the same thing.
Yeah. So, but that's basically what I've been playing lately. So, if we're ready to move on, and we can go ahead and talk about game mastering.
Sounds good.
Okay, let's start with planning. When you're planning your game as Game Master, what are some of the tricks you use to maybe reduce prep time?
Well, there's a lot of different things. It's part of the question is how you run your game. And I personally prefer more of a sandbox style of play, where rather than having a very set plan for exactly what's going to happen, or having a dungeon where it's a question of do you go left or right, I prefer adventures where the players have a fair amount of control over what direction they go, where they have a clear goal. They sort of know what they're trying to accomplish, but there's a lot of different ways they could take it. And so for me, preparing an adventure is very much sort of coming up with the concrete, what the key scenes that are going to matter in this story are going to be, and then trying to come up with sort of as many sort of odds and ends of, and what are the things that are going to connect these? What are the things that could happen in between, depending what paths that they take? So as I say, that's certainly a thing for me, is basically having a list of the sort of major locations, important NPCs that I could decide to bring in, depending what they do, and just sort of assembling all the different elements. But as I said, that's for a more sort of sandbox style where you don't know exactly what the players are going to do. I don't, other than that, it's it's a broad question. What sort of things do you do?
I've got one that I've learned whenever it comes to, because I've tried running sandbox games and my groups tend not to like, they like something where they like kind of being led around by the nose almost, because
absolutely.
If I give them, some groups will love being able to explore and look around and stuff, but at least my last group, if I didn't have, okay, here's the breadcrumb trail to where you need to go next, they would just meander and get lost in the plot and wander around. But one thing I've learned when I have run sandbox games where I was running them and the players were exploring it, is something that helped me out a lot in focusing what I'm doing is, if there's a major decision, like, okay, you guys tracked down this map, and this map, gave you the location of this thingy that you wanted to go investigate, but you decided to go do this thing instead first. Ask them at the end of your session, okay, now that you guys have done this, what are your plans to do next?
Right.
And then they'll tell you, okay, we're going to go to this location. So you go, okay, I've got to get that location narrowed down and focused and basically figure out that location. It gives you a week to prep instead of having to prep, okay, well, they can go here, 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 and here. Right. So I better have all those ready now. It lets you, you can give all those locations a general overview, but it lets you, now I'm going to stat out all the monsters and the NPCs and the traps and everything else and get the map together perfectly and do every little thing for this location because I know where they're going now.
Well, there's a couple different things I'd say there. I mean, one of the questions is we sort of started this as what do you do sort of right before the game, but that goes back to the whole question of what do you do before you even start the campaign. To me, two of the most important things for a game master are know your players.
Agreed.
And that comes on two levels, both for you just personally. Get to know, you've got to make sure you know what do they like. Are they people who want to, negotiate and have intrigue with someone? Or are they knights at the dinner table and they're just going to want to kill every NPC you throw into a room? Part of the thing is that, to me, what makes role-playing, such a great experience, and, the thing that allows it to hold its own against computer games and things like that, is the fact that the story gets to be tailored for the players. Everybody comes to it wanting something different, and you have the chance to make that the story that they want. And you working together have a chance to make that happen. So one thing is just knowing your players. And I say this because one of my favorite games I ever ran was a game that I told everybody it was essentially a sort of Judge Dredd meets Neuromancer cyberpunk superhero campaign. And they all made their cyberpunk superheroes, and they're like the, essentially, if you will, the judges, the superpowered defenders of this city. And what I didn't tell them was that it was actually a Cthulhu campaign. And so they thought, we're going to be fighting, crazy supervillains and having monologues. And instead, all sorts of horrible, inexplicable things began happening. And it worked really, really well because they didn't know what to expect. And to me, one of the most challenging things with horror is, when you're running a Call of Cthulhu game, the players know it's a Call of Cthulhu game. They're expecting things to be, disturbing and weird. And, Lovecraft himself said the greatest fear is fear of the unknown. And so here, because their expectations were for something completely different, they really were taken by surprise and they didn't know what to expect and they didn't know what was going to happen next. And it really worked really well. But the point of all this is I needed to know that the players would enjoy that and that the players would embrace it, because a different group of players could have been pissed off that we were supposed to be playing superheroes. What is this?
Yeah, it's fair to say that bait and switch does not work with all groups.
Exactly, and that's what I'm saying is I would never do that with a group of players I didn't know. Conversely, what I normally would do with a group is to actually, at the start of the game, talk to them about what kind of game do you want. I'd be interested in doing a campaign, like one of the last times I ran an Eberron game a few years back, I sat down and we said we could do something set in the last war, and it'll be a war story, and you'll be a unit of soldiers, and you're working together. Or we could do a espionage campaign, where, it's all intrigue in the Cold War. And so, I presented things that I wanted to do, but then I let them say, yeah, we're not interested in that intrigue thing. We'd much rather do the war story. And then having done that, talk to them about, okay, what is it that interests you about a war story? What kind of things do you want to see happen? And so essentially it's the point you were making earlier about ask them where they want to go next. Because I'm saying from the start, ask them where do they want to go generally? Is this something where you want to be exploring lost continents and finding ancient treasures, or do you want it to be, The Sopranos and Sharn?
Well, I think what you're talking about right now is the social contract that you all kind of get everybody on the same page at the start of the campaign. We're talking about planning for a campaign, not really like an individual session. And you've got some great points there, because it is really important to, number one, know your group, and number two, communicate with them. And make sure that their expectations and your expectations are all understood equally by both parties. And that's just going to make for a better campaign overall, right from the start. And if you get some things set down like tone, and you get some things set down like what he was saying, basically if you understand where I'm coming from and I understand what you want to see happen, we can work together to build that together.
And if you want to hear some examples of how not to do that thing, go back to our horror stories and gaming episode and hear me tell about many times in which I played the wrong campaign with my players because I didn't discuss it with them first.
I've had a few of those myself. So going sort of back to some of the earlier points, when you were saying, make sure to sort of find out where they want to go next so that you don't sort of prepare traps and things for a place they don't even go. A lot of times if I'm doing something, when I say sandbox, it'll still be something where there is a clear goal. So I may say you are trying to catch an escaped fugitive who you know is in the city of Greywall. And essentially, I know that they will eventually catch him, assuming they don't totally screw things up. So I make that encounter. I build out his base. But then I can come up with what are the things they could possibly do to try to find him. They could talk to this dragon-marked house. They could go to this place. They could follow the money trail. So I come up with at least a couple ideas of my own of these are different things they could do that could lead them to that final encounter. I'm, of course, have to be prepared, and this is why I'm saying think about NPCs, think about things like that, for them to think of something I didn't. But what I'm saying is that I know, in a situation like that, I both know what the final end result of it is going to be, and generally speaking, I know, well, they're not going to get there until they at least find the middleman here. And so, okay, that's another encounter that I put together. And the point is, I leave it flexible as to how they find that guy, but again, they know and I know they've got to find that guy if they're going to, accomplish what they're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, you're absolutely right here, and I just want to point out, I think it's really important to know as a GM that when you're talking about breadcrumbing, when you're talking about giving them those options to get from A to B, it's important to realize, and this is something that was hit by Ken Hite very recently in the Gumshoe system, is finding the clue is not nearly as much fun as interpreting the clue. So my suggestion would be very strongly to GMs who are, listening to Keith and nodding their heads and saying, yes, that's what I want to do, is keep in mind and remember that you want them to get the breadcrumb. Having them interpret the breadcrumb is a lot more fun. So don't get in their way. If there's a roll and they need to get a clue and they fail the roll, they still get the clue. There's just a complication involved.
Well,
that's all I would say
all
about that.
They might miss some of the context, or they might not find. They may find it, but they don't find it in the way that they. Okay, so this You found the scroll that he had dropped. Instead of, you find the scroll he had dropped with this little drawing on the sand that was next to it, or something like that. I'm coming up off the top of my head, but they might miss something attached to it.
Yeah. I mean, that's the basic concept of failing forward. Is a failure may make things more difficult. Now you may have to, deal with this gang that you weren't going to have to deal with, or the guy may know you're coming, or things like that. But that, you want to make sure you weren't planning a game where a failed die roll suddenly ends the story, because
you can stonewall yourself very easily if you do something like that.
Going back to the interpreting clues, it is very interesting on that. I have this one game I ran when I was traveling around the world that I ended up running the same adventure 56 times. And part of the adventure, and the thing about it is, because of my style of running things, it never played exactly the same way twice, and I never got bored of running it. And, I was always interested to see, well, what did the players come up with this time? One of the elements of it was a murder mystery. They're basically trying to find this guy, and the people, the possible leads keep turning up dead. And so they're sort of on the trail of this, trying to figure out what's going on, who's killing the people they need to talk to, what's the story here. And I remember the third time I ran it, about 3/4 of the way through the adventure, the players, one of the players stopped and said, well, wait a second. We've got clue 1, clue 2, and clue 3. It's Colonel Mustard. And they're all like, yes, you're right. It's totally Colonel Mustard. And it totally was not Colonel Mustard. And the thing was, it was sort of this choice of, you've got this whole thing of, you don't want to have the players essentially feel that they can't fail, because then what's the point? If it doesn't matter who they think the murderer is, because they'll always be right, well then what's the point of having a mystery? At the same time, the key here was that their interpretation of the clues made sense. It just wasn't an interpretation I had foreseen someone making. And so looking at it, I was like, okay, well, I can just go ahead and they can discover it's Miss Scarlet, and they'll be like, okay, I didn't see that. Or I can do what I did, which was change the ending. So they get there and it's Colonel Mustard, and they, are high-fiving and they think they're the best detectives ever. The point of it was, again, it was about the interpretation of the clues, and their interpretation made sense. It just wasn't the one I had come up with. And so it was a better story for having them, for changing my plan and embracing theirs, because it was the story that made sense to them. And what I like about
role-playing... It was the better experience, right? It was the better,
exactly.
It was the better experience because they all had more fun that way.
Well, and the point was, they felt like they had solved a mystery. And if I just said at the end, you're wrong, right, exactly. And there's a couple ways to handle this. I could have just said, you're wrong. And they would have been like, I guess that was possible. Should have seen that, The other possibility, of course, was I could have continued to throw out more breadcrumbs and tried to push them back towards my original plan. It's not like you have to do it. But like I said, as this case was, their interpretation made sense. It was, it was just that I hadn't considered that. And that's what I like about role-playing, is when I write a novel, the only vision I get is my vision. And when I watch a TV show, I have tons of times watching TV where I will see something, I'll say, oh my God, they're doing this great plan. Oh, that's so clever. And then it gets to the end and it's not what I thought it was going to be. And I'm just like, really? That's the plot you went with? That's lame. And what I like
Sounds
about
like you and I watch a lot of the same TV.
Yeah. And what I like about role-playing is that in this situation, I was able to look at it and say, that's the answer that makes sense to them. So why not make it that answer?
I've got to tell a quick story in response to this, actually, Keith, because you have an excellent point there about empowering players and about, kind of cherishing the experience rather than the story of the game. And I've got a really good story about this. My friend Robert Dorff runs superhero games, and I've played in a lot of them, and he's a very, very talented game master. And he was running a game, a superhero game, with his friends, and his wife happens to be one of his players and has been in almost all of his games. So during the beginning of the adventure, he starts them off with the superheroes repelling an attack from a giant monster attacking the city. And he has this big scene planned with how the giant monster is going to attack and how they're going to fend it off. And all of a sudden his wife's character says, wait, this is a distraction from the real crime. I'm going to stop fighting the giant monster and go look for the real crime, because that's always how it happens. There's a distraction from the real crime. And Robert was faced with a very tough decision. He's like, well, this adventure is really about the giant monster attacking the city. But he wanted to, empower his wife and say, well, okay, you're right. There is a real crime happening somewhere else in the city, because that was the more fun answer. And, I don't envy him for being put in that position. Certainly it had to have been a little bit awkward, but it was, I think ultimately it was a good illustration of player empowerment, and trying to decide, what's the best course of action now.
And that's the point, is it's a balancing act. Because like I said, if the players just feel like it doesn't matter, we'll get the answer right whatever we come up with, well then there's not really much point to having a mystery. And as I said, and with a different group of players with a different plot, I would have tried to just steer them back onto the path I had planned. But it is a matter of, you always want to be ready to let go of what you had planned and, embrace the ideas that the players come up with. That, this isn't something you have to or should be doing alone.
That's a really good point, Keith. And I want to ask you a question, actually, that kind of follows up on something you said way earlier. You mentioned that you were talking about a sandbox-style approach, and you said that you would create a number of key scenes. And I want to ask you this question. If you are doing a session for, say, a 4-hour session, how many key scenes do you prepare for a 4-hour session?
Totally depends on the system, because, it's the kind of thing where, especially if you're dealing with a combat system, certain systems are going to handle it much faster or slower than the others. Personally, I tend to do essentially a key scene an hour.
Okay.
And then I have things to fill in extra space if I need them. So that's the point, is I'll always come up with a list of sort of little side things that could happen if essentially we're running long or short. And the point is, if I know the long-term goal, I can certainly predict, okay, this is where they're trying to get to. They're going to have to go to at least 2 of these places out of these 3 or 4 I've come up with to get the information they need to get to the final place. So given that, it may be that I have a couple that they don't use, but on the other hand, I may pull those scenes or locations back in the next adventure. Again, ideally, it's not wasted effort, because I'll find some use for it somewhere down the line.
Right.
Beyond that, it again just gives the players the feeling that they are choosing their path and that it's not just, on the rail. Now, as you were saying earlier, sometimes players want to be on a path. It's all about knowing your group. It's just, for this style of game, that's how I do things.
Well, there's multiple styles of game. Daryl and I have talked about in the past something we call the adventuring paradigm, where, like in a game of Shadowrun, the adventuring paradigm is you are a team of Shadowrunners. Mr. Johnson hires you for his very specific job, which is not that different from an old man in a tavern who has a quest for you. And if you have a strong adventuring paradigm in a particular campaign or a particular game setting, it can reduce some of that prep time on the GM, because he has a pretty solid way of just sort of handing the players at least the starting point for the night's adventure. Dark Heresy has another very strong adventuring paradigm as well.
Well, and that's the point with Phoenix, is that in Phoenix, you are a military strike team. It's essentially, while the setting is nothing like it, scenario-wise, it's a little like Aliens. You are being dropped into an area with a clear goal. And so that is something that, again, when I say Phoenix tells a specific type of story, it's because you're not just an adventuring group randomly deciding, are we in it for money or are we in it for whatever. It's you are people with a very clear mission, and you might have different ways to accomplish that mission. At the start of the adventure, you know exactly what it is you're trying to accomplish, and generally speaking, you probably have a limited time in which to accomplish it.
So how many drops is this for you, Lieutenant?
Exactly. Game over, man.
Simulated.
One of the things I wanted to go back to when you were talking about mystery, one thing I would really like to point out for when you're prepping an adventure or when you're writing the story or plot to your adventure, there's really two different kinds of mysteries you can run. There's one that's typically the television mystery, which is a more procedural. That is very definitely a breadcrumby point A to point B to point C. It's like Law and Order and Castle and Psych and all those shows pretty much follow the same pattern, which is you find out about the crime, you find a clue, it leads you to this person, you talk to this person, they may try to run, they may try to fight you, whatever, you find out the information that leads you to this person, that leads them to this person, that leads them to this person, that leads them to the suspect, who may have been person 2 that they talked to in the first place. But there's not really a lot of actual quote-unquote figuring out the mystery in it. It's just the mystery is the structure for the story you're telling.
Yep, absolutely.
Now, there's also the whodunit, which is bigger in if you're doing a mystery film, especially the TV movies that they'll do, like the PBS ones, especially that they're 2 hours long, or novels especially, will be a lot more whodunit. Hercule Poirot, obviously, is one of the prototypes of that, in which you, as the audience, are given all the information, and then you have to piece it together along with the detective. Now, one of these is very easy to run in a role-playing game, and that is the linear style. That's the procedural. It is very simple to run that because it's the same thing as any other adventure, except for instead of trying to beat the monster to take its treasure, they're trying to capture the suspect to get the information. The whodunit can be very difficult to run in a role-playing game because your players probably aren't trained detectives, so sometimes they may not piece all the clues together as well unless you give them, either you can hand it to them on a silver platter so it's obvious, or you can make them work for it, in which case they may sit there for 2 hours arguing over who it could be. There's one trick that I use when I'm doing an actual mystery where they have to actually puzzle it out. I do what I call 3 stages of clues. The first stage is going to be something very, very subtle. Like that someone's hair was disheveled, or something that's really subtle that I'm definitely telling them, I'm giving them the clue, or they're obviously going to find the clue, but they're going to have to work to piece that together. If they don't get it, I move to the medium-sized clue. That's something that it's not going to take nearly as much puzzling together and drawing from facts and worrying about the history or whatever to try to figure that out. If they still don't get it, that's when I smack them upside with the clue hammer. Okay, here's the clue that's an obvious blinking arrow pointing to the next thing. So that's just the way I do it to keep them on track.
Yeah, this comes back to the sort of a couple of the points we were making before. Is you can certainly design an adventure in which, given enough time, the mystery will essentially solve itself. And, they will eventually end up where they need to be. The key there is if you have something like that in place, you do want to have them feel that they are rewarded if they solve it themselves. And
or
this
that
comes
there's
back
consequences
to
if they don't solve it fast enough. Like,
precisely.
we have to stop him before he kills again. And if you have to wait for that third clue hammer, then he killed again.
That's what comes back to what we were saying before about failing forward is, that sort of works both ways. When you fail, well, okay, that doesn't end things, but maybe it makes things more challenging. And the reverse is saying, well, when you succeed, it means things are, you feel that has rewarded you in some way, that it made a difference that you succeeded. I was in a campaign, actually, not a campaign, a one-shot recently, that the guy was using the Dread system. Do you know Dread?
That's the one with the Jenga tower, isn't it?
That's the one with the Jenga tower, and essentially anytime you try to do something risky, you have to draw tiles from a Jenga tower. The Game Master tells you how many to draw, and if the tower falls, you die. So it creates this building level of suspense of, although one can argue exactly, the sort of nature of suspense in this sort of thing. Basically, things get more and more dangerous, and someone eventually is going to go down. This particular scenario was a sort of Gravity meets Armageddon. We are trying to get this rickety rocket ship to the moon to shut down this doomsday thing. There's this doomsday cannon on the moon. And one of the things he did there was to, at the start, basically ask us, what is a city that's important to our character? Somewhere that either we came from, or hometown, or what is it and why is it important?
Houston, you have a problem.
Exactly. And the point was, if we'd failed early on, rather than just saying, hey, we're 10 minutes into the game and you suck at Jenga, well, you're dead. Basically, what he had in place was, well, every time you screw up, boom, there goes your hometown. And sort of a way to have something that was a frightening incentive and yet was not actually death for us.
He just put some meaningful stakes into the game.
Exactly, and that's a whole nother sort of discussion, but it does come back to the failing forward, is having things that the players care about beyond simply their hit points. What are the things you've put in the game that you can take away or hurt, or things like that, that give them a stake.
And I know that the Angry DM has been doing a blog series for a while over a campaign he's been running, in which the player characters in this, I do believe he's running D&D, or it's a Pathfinder game, but the characters, just like Phoenix, they're immortal. They don't know why. Every time they die, they are resurrected within like a day or a week or something like that at this shrine. And he's doing it as a challenge to himself, because if you've ever read Angry DM's blogs or his Twitter feed, he is a killer DM. So he's created a campaign in which he cannot kill the players. A TPK means nothing because they're all going to pop back up again.
Right.
And he did it as a challenge to prove that player death is not the only consequence. So, sure, they were being reckless and charging head forward and weren't planning and weren't thinking, and they failed at something. And when they came back, they found out that a village that they had been using as their home, the firstborn, I think it was the firstborns had all died. And some of these were characters that they knew, NPCs that they had been interacting with. It really hit a blow to them.
This impacts something that I do when I'm writing a story for an adventure. One thing I always try to put in there is I try to put in a moral quandary or a very difficult choice. And the reason why is because I want to give the player characters an idea that they made some kind of meaningful impact at the end of the campaign.
Absolutely.
Now, this goes back to something we've talked about a little before in this episode, where it's really not so much about the story, it's about the experience. And so I'm trying to give them that experience of after the adventure's over, they're all like, yeah, well, we chose X, so Y happened, right? They feel like they are the agents of that change. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples, at least for our listeners, a couple of examples of ways you can look at to give you some ideas for this. A really good example was actually the Dragon Age video game from BioWare. Had a whole bunch of really good, tough choices that your character was asked to make along the way. You had to decide, whether the child would live or die, or whether his mom would live or die, but somebody was going to die. And it was the only way to solve the crisis. So think about that. When you're designing a story for your game and you want to give your player characters a feeling like they made some kind of impact, come up with an idea that makes them choose between two outcomes and make it to where it's a meaningful choice. And I think you'll find that they will enjoy that story and enjoy that experience of playing in that story much more.
One way you can really pull that is if you another way to give them that choice is to give them the option of, okay, if you take this action, it's going to benefit you, but it's going to be really, really bad for someone that you know or care about. Or you can take the option and take the bad thing onto yourselves to save the other people. And that's more along the lines of, that one's really touching. You have to know your group. because they can take it to a really dark place in some cases, depending on the campaign. But that's a really good way to add that sort of moral quandary. And it's also kind of like that, okay, you came across the goblin child. Do you kill it or do you let it live? That thing, that moral in game, it can be really, it can end really, really badly if you do it that way. But if you handle it well and your group can handle it and play it maturely, that can add a lot of depth to your story, is giving them that choice to, are we heroes or are we, especially if there's consequences that, it's going to benefit us, but we need this to benefit us so we can solve the bigger problem. So it's a question of, are we always good? Do we always have to save the one person, or are we more focused on the greater good? Are we able to make these little sacrifices along the way to accomplish a bigger goal that's going to have more impact for more people in the greater part of the world?
What does it mean to be a hero? That's the question I always like to try and answer. And
do your players want to be heroes? Certainly going back to Eberron, I mean, one of the things we said for Eberron, sort of from day one, was that it was about shades of gray. And, again, film noir was one of the early inspirations. And, also having things where good and evil are not as clear cut. And, the person who is the evil person may actually nonetheless be a very valuable and important person for that community. And if you just come in and kill this guy, well, what's going to happen now he's gone? And likewise with Phoenix is certainly one where all our adventures are again designed that there's no just single possible outcome. It very much is, there's different choices you can make, and for that matter, you could also fail. And that any which way, the consequences of those choices are things that you will carry with you and things that will affect further stories down the road. And I think that's sort of the thing to me, is players just feeling that their actions have consequences.
Exactly. That's
good or bad.
That was something I wanted to talk about a little bit, was if you do this do the failing forward thing, one of the big drawbacks to that is that, again, like you said earlier, it can feel like they're getting everything handed to them. There's no actual challenge, because even when they screw up, they still win. But one thing that I really always try to do in my games is make sure that they see the consequences of their actions, both good and ill. If they get rid of this goblin tribe that's been harassing the village, or if they manage to steal this prototype and get it to the corporation, or extract this willing person in Shadowrun from one corporation to the place he wants to work, I want them to see the effects that this had on the world at large. So if they wipe out the goblin tribe, oh hey, that goblin tribe no longer affects the village, so yay, the trade route's free. However, the much higher level brigands who were not affecting the trade route, so the village is safe, but the trade route's in danger because these wandering people were coming in, and now they're attacking the trade routes because they were outnumbered by the goblins before, so they weren't attacking. Now the goblins are gone, so the village is safe, but the trade route's in danger, so you have to deal with that problem. Or, like I said, the extraction, or just make sure that they see that when they make these choices, for good or for ill, have them, if they do something good and they do something heroic, reward them for it. If they succeed, reward them for it. Okay, you now see the effects of when you wiped out this goblin tribe. The village is safe. You see everyone is a lot more relaxed and happy, and there's smiles on people's faces for the first time since you've been to this village, because they're no longer in danger. And then you can bring in the other plot elements if you want. But if they do something that's not as good, like, okay, we're going to break into this corporation, steal the prototype, and get it to this guy, then you read in the paper the next day, or not the paper, but the news feed in Shadowrun. But anyway, you see it, R&D developer so-and-so commits suicide after project goes missing. So, oh, hey, we just did something that had impact on the world. This guy, because of our actions, killed himself.
Again, it still comes back to, you got to know your players and know whether that's something that will have any impact on them. Because, some players will be like, that's pretty funny. It
depends on the tone. It depends on the tone in the campaign, too. Like, if I'm running my Venture Brothers hero campaign, which is just for fun, and it's just for people who love the show Venture Brothers, and just to sort of enjoy the crazy fun that world has, I'm not going to be so heavy on the, deep
Right.
moral quandaries
Yeah,
or tough choices. It's really going to be more about zany hijinks. So it's
those were just two
things
things that popped immediately. Those are just two things that popped immediately into my head in terms of showing the consequences. Even in something that's cartoony like that, or even in a game like Paranoia, you can still have those show the consequences. It's okay. You killed all this guy's clones but one. So now he's just got the one clone, and he's something happened. You can show him even comedically. You can show the consequences of the actions, but their actions should have some impact.
Yes, absolutely.
It's up to you to determine the tone of your game, and you can actually kind of twist your tone around a little bit by how you present those consequences. If you want a big pink mohawk Shadowrun game, you can show instead of if you're wanting a deep like black trench coat game, go with my suggestion because that's kind of what I play. If you're doing the pink mohawk over the top thing, the consequence might be that this company's stock fell, and you can point and laugh at them, ha ha ha, and then show on the vid feed the VP of that department throwing a hissy fit at a press conference.
Well, I mean, another
and there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, and another weird example, just throwing things around. You have the guys get the prototype weapon and sell it to Unscrupulous Bastard Incorporated. And next fight when someone gets, or next adventure when someone gets seriously injured, point out that, well, that's because the gang is armed with those, new weapons from Unscrupulous Bastard Incorporated. And, so all I'm saying is there it is something
those new armor-piercing rounds are on the street now.
Again, it's a matter of finding the hooks that are going to resonate with your players, whether it's they'll be sad that they've crippled this researcher and caused him to commit suicide, or whether they'll be sad because they are now being shot by more powerful weapons. One way or another, you can find something that is going to feel meaningful to them. And we've been focusing on the negatives here, but again, and that when they do something that they feel good about, and they feel that they made an exceptional, they were exceptional in their actions or their choices or things, well, hopefully they should feel that makes a difference on the world too. And they see the positive from their actions, as we've been talking about.
Yeah, for me, like when it comes to DMing and a story, there's nothing better than when it feels very immersive, when it feels like it's responding to me, right? It's interactive, it's immersive. I feel like I'm, actually a part of that game. And that's where I think you really get the most benefit out of making the game interactive and making the game react to what the players do.
And I mean, there's lots of different ways to do this, and there's lots of ones that work with different groups. I mean, I will just say in the Phoenix games I've been running recently, one of the things I tend to do is to ask the players to tell me about their commanding officer. Instead of just saying your commanding officer is this grizzled old guy called, Sergeant, Flargan, and just throwing him at him, I said, well, you tell me about your commanding officer. What's your relationship with him? What's he like? What's he called? And that way the group themselves sort of builds their story a little. And then I'll pick it up and I'll fill that guy out. And, what I'm saying is that they want him to be a crusty drill sergeant, well, then that's what they're going to get. And if they want him to be a very encouraging, wise guy, well, then that's what they'll get. And it's a slightly different approach. Sometimes it's better, sometimes what the group wants is for me to have a deep world with deeply defined NPCs. But sometimes here it works because they feel, this is the movie they want to see, if you see what I'm saying.
This is absolutely one of the points I had written down for random tips and tricks later in the show, but opportunities for the PCs to be creative is a big, big tool in the DM's tool bag, where you can say things like, I love your idea about, let's make the commanding officer. Things that I like to do is like costume changes. Like in a very recent Accursed game, the player characters had to get on a train, and there's only one train in like the setting, so it's a very high class, noble, it's the Orient Express, back in its heyday. Mm-hmm. So the characters had to change their wardrobe from their adventuring gear, armor, and weapons, and wear something, upscale. And I didn't tell them what they were wearing. I said, what do you think your character wants to wear? What, since you can afford basically, whatever you want, what are you gonna dress in? And it was really cool to see them come up with, their new looks and it gave you not only insight into their characters, but into the fun they were having with the setting. And I like the fact that you allowed them to make up their commanding officer, because you can also do that with their background. You can say,
absolutely.
You could ask them, like, is there a guy that you know in this city? Well, who is he? If you give them a little bit of narrative control, players really eat that up as a fun way to, get them involved and get them engaged with the story and the setting that you're building.
And that really starts bringing us more towards characters that you're using in your game as NPCs and how you can really make the world come alive through them. But before we do that, I'm getting a little bit parched, so I'm going to get another round from the bar. So we'll be right back after these words from our sponsor.
All right.
Hello, gamers. I'm Daryl Mott Jr. from Cool News Tabletop and the Gamers Tavern podcast, which you probably know because I'm betting I was just talking a second ago. I'm sure you already know about DriveThruRPG, as it is the biggest repository for digital copies of your favorite games. Dungeons & Dragons, Shadowrun, Battletech, World of Darkness, Numenera, Fate, and so many more. And sometimes there are pennies on the dollar because, face it, PDFs can sometimes be so much more convenient than print copies, but if you need print copies, they sell those too. So if you want to support the Gamers Tavern podcast, click on the affiliate links in the show notes and check out DriveThruRPG.
And we're back with the Gamers Tavern episode 9. We have with us Keith Baker, and we're discussing GM tips and tricks. And when we last left our heroes, they were on the adventure of describing character in DMing advice. So we were about to jump into talking about characters.
I'm going to tell you my number one greatest trick for making sure that your players actually remember your NPCs. It's something that I learned from Jim Butcher when it comes to writing. Is that you don't need to do this for every single NPC that comes along, but anyone that's going to be a major reoccurring person in your game, you want to give them 3 traits that are unique to them. The first is always going to be something physical. For example, in the Dresden Files books, Jim Butcher calls Gentleman John Marconi, always describes him in the first scene he appears in every single book he comes in as having eyes the color of old money. He uses that phrase or some variation on it every single time. When Thomas Wraith shows up, he always compares him to some type of male model. Now, using those unique identifiers, and they're used only for those characters, even if someone else has green eyes, they're not going to be described that way for anyone else. Anyone else who is a really big buff guy is not going to be described as a male model. Those phrases are attached to those characters. So when you describe the tavern keeper that has the pink patch over his eye, that guy they're going to associate that trait with that character physically. And that's what all 3 of these do, is gives them a unique trait that's not going to be anything that anyone else has, that immediately associates that character to them. The second one is either give them a unique voice or accent, and if you can't do that kind of thing, give them a catchphrase at least. Something that's verbal that tells them every time. So, for example, I had in one of my campaigns a black dragon that was in disguise as a human who was who owned the magic shop in town, the curio shop. And I gave him a Cajun accent because black dragon swamps. Come on, it fits. So that gave him an immediate identification.
Just make sure to send your emails to...
Hey, I'm half Cajun. I'm allowed to do it.
All right.
I hear that you call us coon asses. I'm going to be pissed, but I'm allowed to say it. But anyway, another thing I've done before was I had a captain of the guard in a town. He'd always use the phrase, yeah, I'd give my last copper for whatever he was needing at the time. I'd give my last copper for a day off. I'd give my last copper for a good ale. Something like that. And it gave them something, again, to anchor to that character. The third one is I give them some sort of personality trait. For example, that black dragon I mentioned before was racist against elves. If you're doing a sci-fi campaign, you could always have your mysterious alien or your AI character or whatever always take every single idiom as literal. So they're always interpreting everything you say as the literal words you're saying. And it's just some sort of find something that gives them. I had a hacker that was obsessed with fashion. So he was always commenting on, oh, that's a great suit. You're wearing that ratty old thing again? And I always described it. And his trait was he was always wearing a sharp 1,000 Union suit. So that was, give them these personality traits, and it's ways for them to get past that, because I always try to come up with great names for my characters, and I do a lot of research and everything, and then I say, okay, so you guys have, here's the necromancer, or whatever name that has like 3 levels of entomology meeting behind it, and they go, okay, we're just going to call him Bob to keep track. So it's a way to get around that and get these important NPCs through that barrier and into their minds, and keep them there, and it makes it easier for them to remember who's who and keep them straight.
Now, I agree with all of that. I will say, for me, certainly with some key NPCs, and this sort of comes to the question of, is there something that logically suggests itself? I also like having certain movements or body language for a particular NPC. You know, if I'm playing something like a goblin or a dragon or a night hag, I try to sort of shift my own posture, or, you know, how you hold your head or things like that, you know, to again just give them a physical sense of who they're actually speaking to. And certainly, yes, I can't appear like a dragon, but I can change, you know, maybe
not without chemical enhancement,
head forward more, you know, again, just somehow portray, you know, do what you can to portray that character in a way that they can immediately say, oh, right, this guy.
Exactly, and that's what it's all about, is giving them traits or quirks or something that are specifically for that NPCs that immediately triggers in their head. Oh, hey, it's that guy that did this that one time. Yeah, I know who that is. So you're not having to explain every time.
With that said, you know, there's a certain degree to which you want the strongest characters like this to be characters that you do expect to use more than once. So they do get that, oh, it's that guy. Whereas on the other hand, if you get too deep with absolutely every NPC in the game, and this is the beggar who's just here to ask them for a coin and will never be seen again, you can potentially sort of overwhelm people, you know, trying to keep track of every single thing.
I think it's also important to remember that if, you know, NPCs in the game, and you can really get attached to them as a GM, it's very easy to do this. It's also important to remember you want to avoid the Elminster syndrome. You want to make it to where they have flaws, they are fallible, and that they are not sacrosanct, right? I mean, it's important to remember that although you want to use them multiple times and you want them to be important in the game, they should never be more important than the player characters, because that's probably one of the first steps towards deprotagonization.
Yeah, you don't want a GMPC. You want fully breathing characters that support the story you're trying to tell and support the characters and their actions, or hinder the characters and their actions depending on that character's motivations, whether they're an accomplice or a villain to the players. So you definitely don't want to put your own little Mary Sue in the game to kind of run everything for them. It's the character, it's the story of the PCs. They're the main characters in this story, and you always have to keep that in mind even when you're creating these memorable characters.
Yeah, and that was, of course, something that was a concrete design element in Eberron, was even with the characters, you know, the NPCs in the game world who are more powerful than the players, all of them have limitations and reasons that they can't just solve the problems. You know, you get the most powerful cleric in the game basically loses almost all of her power if she leaves her temple. And so, yeah, she's incredibly powerful, but she can't go fight the Tarascan Sharn. You know, the most powerful druid is a tree, and he can't go anywhere because he's a tree. And, you know, it's always good to make sure, even because there is a point to having powerful NPCs in the game for certain stories, but it's always this question of how do you make them not overshadow, you know, not make the players irrelevant. You also take a game like 13th Age, where what that does with the icons is specifically have these, you know, very powerful characters, but then every character is sort of defined by their relationship with one or more of these people. So it's about sort of making you important I mean, again, it's a way of sort of setting you in the world. Are you an enemy of this person? Are you their top agent? Are you, their son? And so again, rather than making you irrelevant because they're around, it's making you directly relevant because they're around.
Yeah,
So,
I would say it's important to distinguish between power and importance, because you can have a character,
absolutely.
you can have an NPC who's incredibly powerful, but he shouldn't be more important to the story than the player characters. That's really my point. Is
they can even be more important in the game world itself. Like you can have the powerful king of the kingdom who it's a magitocracy, I believe is the term, or arcanaut.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Anyway, he's like 20th level wizard. He runs everything. He's very powerful, but he's an important person in this world. He helped shape this kingdom, but he's not more important than the characters in the story being told.
That's what I mean.
Even if he is more important in the world. So you can have these very, very important characters in the world, just so long as they're not overshadowing the characters in the story. He's not coming along right behind them and saying, haha, we have now found this thing, now let me kill it. Okay, now I'm going to collect all the treasure and thank you very much and leave. Or anything. You don't want to do something like that.
Keith made a very good point when he said relevance is the key. He says, they need to be less relevant to the story than the player characters. And I agree. I like that description.
Well, and there's a bunch of different things that come up in these examples as well. One is making sure that you don't always equate power with level, as it were. That, if you take our world, the general, more often than not, can probably get his ass kicked by the Delta Force Commando, but the general is a more powerful figure in the world. That, you don't have to be the best fighter to lead the army. You have to be good at leading armies. Leaders don't have to be necessarily tough. Now, taking the magocracy example, well, there they do. That's sort of the point, is it's saying he has to be the best wizard. So obviously, that means he's the best wizard. But even there, you could also say, yes, but part of what it means to be the ruler of this magocracy is that he is personally maintaining the defensive spells of the kingdom. And if he were ever to drop that level of concentration, essentially half of his mind is always devoted to maintaining that. And if he ever dropped it, well, now the kingdom is going to suffer magical attack. And so, yes, he is innately more powerful than your players by a long shot, and that is what allows him to be the ruler. But being the ruler is also what means he can't just go off to this dungeon and,
Right.
kill this dragon, because he can't take a day off from his job. All it is to me is making sure that if you have a powerful character around, the players themselves don't feel like, so we're just doing this because he's too busy, or he could be doing this, he just can't be bothered. That there is something that makes them feel like they are important, even if they're not necessarily powerful.
Okay. That's a good way to put it. Now, let me ask you another question. Let's say we're talking about a very specific type of character in a adventure. And as from the perspective of a GM, what is important to you when you're designing the villain?
Oh, I've got a lot of stuff. The villain is one of the most important NPCs you're going to create in any especially if it's a long-term reoccurring villain. You
Absolutely.
have to think them through properly. You don't want the cat-stroking, maniacal, I'll get you next time, gadget, just evil for the evils guy. That's boring. That's not an evocative character. You should be able to, in my opinion, flip the story of any story you tell to the other perspective. You should be able to tell the story through the villain's eyes, and it's not going to be as good of a story because they don't have to overcome the same challenges or anything like that, but you should be able to see them as the protagonist in the story. Maybe even not the hero, but you can look through their eyes if you were looking at it from that side and see, okay, I can see why they did what they did from their point of view. Their point of view makes everyone is the hero of their own story is the idea. And you have to have that villain think that they're doing, maybe know they're doing something evil, but they think they're doing the right thing.
Well, I mean, that's sort of the thing to me is there's another way to look at that. I completely agree that, I mean, the point is villains need to make sense. Very few people sort of look at themselves and believe that they are evil. To me, it is about, can you understand why they are doing what they are doing, even if you disagree with it? And that's certainly the case with Eberron, is you have a lot of people who, again, are certainly evil, but we always want them to make sense. You want to see how a person could have this belief, even if they disagree with you. Again, to me, going back to making a compelling villain is them just having, again, a concrete role in the world. Why do you not want them to do whatever it is they want to do? What are going to be the consequences if they succeed, and why does that personally matter to you? So, just making sure that the players feel they have some sort of personal stake in what's going on, and that this isn't something where if they just say, well, this isn't our problem and walk away, that, that doesn't matter. Again, if this bandit king is going to slaughter everyone in this village, why do they care about this village? What is it that makes them actually, the bandit, for whatever reason, as you said, may see himself as the hero. Why do the players see him as the villain? What is it that makes it personal to them?
Now, I like to say that there's a really wide variety of different types of villains you can bring into a game, but I think for shorthand, if I was just going to tell somebody, for some GMing advice, I would say you should probably narrow it down to two things. And those two things are, one of them being what Daryl was suggesting, which is the sympathetic or tragic or relatable bad guy. But the other one is the unrelenting force. You can have a villain that is basically just, I am going to crush the world because I'm going to crush the world, because reasons, right? And as long as it's something that it's kind of like the Terminator, you can't reason with it, you can't bargain with it, it can only be opposed. And it will never ever
stop until you are dead.
Exactly, and there's a good place for that.
And there's a middle ground in there too of what we've got here. Is I completely agree with you, and and there is a place for this is just the evil that will oversweep the world or oversweep the village or whatever it is, or the Lovecraftian. We cannot understand this, it is beyond us, but it will destroy us. So, on the one hand, you have the hero who you can see or the villain who you can see their tragic story. On the other, you have the vast, unstoppable, force that cannot be understood. In the middle, there's also room for the sociopath.
Oh, yeah, there's all kinds of different ones.
Oh, sure, but all I was saying is that speaking to the sociopath is the person who it's not that their story is particularly tragic or whatever, but you can just see that they are a person who just doesn't give a damn about anyone else and will take what they want. And as you say, there's many, many, many other sort of different types. But I'm just saying, going back to the bandit, you could say, okay, the bandit really needs this money because these people fought took the land away from his family. And you could do that. Or you could just, again, present this bandit as clearly someone who is just basically, he is motivated by greed and he doesn't care who he hurts to get what he wants. And so all I'm saying is that... go on.
Even in those cases, though, if you looked at it through the bandit's point of view, the actions, the logic is still there. The things he's doing still make sense. It's, I need money, these people have money, and they may even have an entire moral system in their head that's completely different than ours. It's, these people are weak. Why do these weak people have money when I'm strong?
But that's what I'm saying is that there's two different ways to take it there. Generally speaking, I entirely agree with you. That's one of the core points of the Blood of Vol in Eberron is that, yes, this is the necromantic religion and it is technically an evil force, but it is actually a force that you can clearly see why people would follow this religion and why it makes sense to them. So again, you could have the bandit saying, what I am doing is testing these people. If they're not strong enough to oppose me, then, I am going to make them stronger. There's all sorts of stories you could do, and I'm saying quite often that does make the story more compelling. But I'm saying, especially if that's usually what it is, sometimes there is the place for the person who, as I said, is simply a sociopath and is simply killing people because he can, and to him that's reason enough. I mean, I'm just saying I don't use that sort of thing very often, but sometimes for that very reason, having the person who, basically, again, it's they want money, you have it, and why shouldn't I kill you to get it? Can be an interesting difference. Mm-hmm.
And this is a psychology thing. Any person, even a complete sociopath, if you get into schizophrenic psychopath, there's a little bit more going on, but even a complete sociopath is going to rationalize what they're doing as the right thing to do, even if it is completely amoral. That's the point I'm making. Now, if you're talking about unknowable things beyond the stars, yes, they have multiple reasons for what they're doing too. We just have absolutely no way of comprehending what they're doing, and that's the horror. So,
see, I think we're talking two different points here. Because my point is, yes, no one is just, I think I am evil. Everyone is the hero of their own story, and we completely agree on that. What I'm saying is, it's the question whether to the player there is an element of sympathy to this character, or whether, despite the fact that the character has a reason, to the player they are a monster. And I'm saying sometimes there is a value to having a monster. Even though, again, I'm saying this is the person who Eberron, more often than not, doesn't. Eberron, generally speaking, again, you take Droem, and the whole point is to say monsters aren't monsters. But I'm saying that for that very reason, if you take, let's say, orcs in Lord of the Rings, and, of course, in Eberron, one of the whole points is to say that goblins and orcs aren't monsters. They have their own cultures. They have their own reasons for wanting to fight people and such. But sometimes you do want the thing where you say, this is a creature that was bred to kill people. And that is its only purpose. And, there is nothing redeeming about it. And that sort of comes back to the Terminator.
You can't negotiate with a zombie apocalypse.
Exactly. And all I'm saying is that...
But even they have goals that they think are right.
Zombies don't have any goals. They're zombies.
I want to eat your brains. That's their goal. That's their motivation. And it makes perfect sense to them because you have brains.
Right, but from the point of relevance to a player character in a campaign, there is no relevance to that motivation.
Well, I'm just saying this is something that, as a GM, you want to keep in mind.
We all agree that a villain needs motivation. The question is, they don't always need tragic motivation.
Yes. And it's just something I'm sorry I keep coming back to this, but even if it's something, the players may not even ever see it, but it's something that you should really think about as a GM in order to make these characters come more alive in the setting, even if it's something that the players never even see. If they don't even know why this person's doing what they're doing, you should know it so you can more effectively portray that character to the players. Well, in my opinion.
Let's be clear. Let's be very clear. Your mileage may vary, and we're just, we're giving our opinions on these things. We're not saying there's only one true way to run your game.
I am.
Well, okay, aside from Daryl. No, maybe Daryl is saying there's only one true way.
I'm kidding.
But the point is that there's a lot of different ways to do it.
I think a key point is, regardless of getting into the psychology of the individual, you always want to at least know what is the motivation for the villain, what are they trying to accomplish, and why is that worth doing? Even if you don't get into their greater, deeper story beyond that. Again, if the bandit wants to destroy this village, why?
It can be extremely simple. It can be just a very basic.
I want to rule the world. Right. Why do I want to rule the world?
Because
reasons.
I can.
Because I can.
Well, what I'm saying is turn it around a different way and say there is a bandit threatening this village. We don't need to know why the bandit needs his money and why he thinks he's the hero for taking it from these people. But one of the questions is, why does this village have money? What is it he wants to take? Where's that come from?
Right.
So just again, building the story, you can say, well, they have, gold because it's tax time and they are getting ready to deliver that gold to the tax man. And if they take it, now, that's going to have consequences for the villagers and so on and so on and so on. I'm just saying that even there, it's a matter of, rather than just saying, well, he's random bandit, well, why, what's he, why is a banditry effective in this place? Why are there there's all sorts of different ways you could take this. But
and
certainly
you just gave us a perfect
segue,
segue, Keith, into something else I wanted to talk about when it comes to how to improve your GMing, which is talking about the setting itself, what you can do to make the world come more alive beyond just the characters that inhabit it.
Yeah, and we're not talking about world building. We're talking about you as the DM sort of bringing an existing setting to life.
Absolutely. And do you just want to dive in, or do you have a specific point to start on?
Well, I was just wanting to, like I said, you gave us the perfect segue for that one. I just wanted to talk more about the setting, how you would make the world feel like it's alive, not necessarily in how you're crafting the world or building the world, but how you as a GM are presenting it to the players so that the players can see that this is a living world.
I mean, again, a core point comes to all of these different things that we've already touched on, is saying, how does it matter to the players? How do they perceive it? One of the things I always tell people when it comes to world building, but it can apply in the small form as well, is, people always say, well, how much is too much? How much detail is more than what's needed? How much should I develop history, for example? And the point to me comes back to, rules of threes. We were already saying 3 details about a character back earlier. Is for any random given thing that you've come up with, can you think of 3 ways that it could actually be used in a story in some way? If you're coming up with history, why does that history matter? So there was a big battle. How is that battle ever going to have an impact on your campaign? And so if you have a village, we'll think about what has happened there. What is some event that, why is there a village here in the first place? Because generally speaking, if you have a thriving community, there's something that helps it succeed. It's a port. It's near particularly fertile fields. It's near a mine. So, okay, boom, there we go. It's near a mine. So there's a whole gold rush thing going on. And you've got people who are coming in looking for a claim. I mean, if you just sort of start grabbing little details like that. So it's not just a town. It's a mining community, or it's a lumber community, and just a few details like that. Well, it's a lumber community, so there's going to be a mill, and there's going to be lumberjacks, and you immediately start getting something to work with that lets players, among other things, realize how this town is different from every other town, and immediately give you a few ideas of some color you can add to NPCs as you start having them pop up.
And one thing you're saying is something that kind of goes back to what I was saying about the characters again, which is it doesn't necessarily have to tie in or anything, but it has to make sense.
Absolutely.
You have to present the players in a way that it makes sense, that they can see the reason. They can, if they want to put in the effort to research it and find out, they can see why this village is where it is. It's on a crossroads between these 2 rivers. These 2 major roads happen to meet in this one place, so a village sprung up around the tavern hall or whatever. Why is this starship in this sector? Because there's unobtainium ore on the planet. There's a reason for the things to be there. It has to make sense. And the same thing goes even when you're going into a dungeon. Why is the dungeon here?
Well, my advice on this subject is going to revolve mostly around reading. I'm going to say if you are a GM and you want to really make the setting feel unique and alive, make sure you read everything there is to know about a setting if it's already an established one. If it's a setting of your own creation, read what you've written about it. Get that information in front of you. And then, once you've done that, once you've gotten your mind kind of wrapped around it, pick out the things that you feel are the most interesting and unique that can apply to the adventure. And once you've gotten that sort of list, and I think Keith has got a good, excellent point, go with the rule of 3. If you can find at least 3 unique things that you really like, find a way to bring those out during the adventure. And that can be anything like, if I'm running Traveler and I want people to understand that the Zodani are the psionic near-human alien race, then I'm going to make sure that you run into a Zodani at one point and say, oh, well, this is Traveler, we're meeting Zodani. Or we're dealing with, Mason cannons on the rim of Deneb. Or, you find things that are unique to that setting and you bring them out and play. And that's really where I would come from, is just read, find the unique bits, and then, this comes also back to Keith saying, your group, find the things that they're going to appreciate the most probably as well.
Well, I think you bring up an interesting point there as well, which ties back to some of the other things we've said about NPCs and villains and things like that, which is, okay, the Zodani, and what makes them different? What makes them interesting? Well, they've incorporated psionics into their culture. So in the encounter that you are going to have with them, how will you perceive that? How will it be different from an encounter with a different human culture? And so again, whether you have them reading your thoughts or whether you have them communicating with one another telepathically, so they just never speak aloud but always just glance at each other and then talk to you. Sort of finding little things like that again make this feel different than because you're dealing with a Medusa or you're dealing with a dwarf.
And it doesn't have to be a huge encounter. It doesn't even have to be the focus of the adventure. But if it is a prominent piece that they remember, then you have communicated part of what you love about the setting to your players.
Mm-hmm. Well, this actually comes up to something I would say. It just makes me think of it right there with what you were describing with Traveler and saying, okay, let's find a couple little things that really get the flavor across, and they don't have to be major things, and coming back to our previous discussion about giving the players a certain amount of narrative control. One of the things that I wrote about a few months ago, but that interests me that I've been playing around with, is in dealing with travel, essentially doing travel by sort of montage, if you will. Because you always get that sort of issue of, well, we're trying to get from point A to point B. The journey should be exciting. We're going through Mirkwood. This should be scary. But how do you do that without sort of just devolving into a random encounter that doesn't really have anything to do with anything and that you don't really want to waste the time on? What I like to do in that sort of situation is essentially present each character with some situation that happens along the way and basically ask them how they resolve that situation. So, saying, okay, well, when you get boarded by Zudani customs officials, yo, smuggler, how do you talk your way out of this? And when you have to decide if you're going to go through the asteroid field, pilot, how do you work your way through? Basically, even down to just saying at the end, okay, dwarf, what's the scariest thing you saw in this forest? What's the one thing that really actually did frighten you? Or even just, well, what's the terrible dream you had last night? But something that basically gives each character just a small little spotlight moment. And the point is, we're not trying to waste a lot of time. This is only going to take us 8 minutes. And we're just going to take a minute or two with each character, but that helps give a sense that, oh, this journey did actually take a while. A bunch of things happened, but we're just sort of cruising through and, but highlighting what it meant to you. That moment when you did something special.
I'm a huge fan of that kind of montage. I really love just sort of going around the table and saying, what did you do? What did you do? And what did you do? And the idea of like the bad dream you had last night, I'm probably going to steal that for my next Accursed adventure because that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's a great solution to a problem that's existed for a while, which is like you said, rolling on random encounters. It's like, okay, you're going through the forest. This night's uneventful. This night's uneventful. This night's uneventful. Okay, fourth night out, then an owlbear comes out and attacks you. And that's filler stuff, and it can be good if you use it right, or if that's the kind of campaign you're running where it is about the travel and the exploration. But the way you're describing it is really good for a more story-focused game, where it lets you get all those moments in without getting down into that mundane, okay, mechanics are right up front of this, this is the random encounter, let's just kill it and get the XP.
Yeah. I mean, the key here is that, if the journey is the adventure, and there's a lot of times when it is, well, then that's a whole different story. But when the point is here is, no, the adventure's the dungeon, but we just want you to feel like it took something to get there, like it was a significant, journey. Let's just highlight a couple interesting scenes. And Again, we're going to say, oh, you run into some bandits on the second day. Hey, rogue, how do you get the group by them? And it could be that he decides, oh, well, I spot them far ahead and we just, because I'm an excellent scout and we just work our way around them. Or it could be that he says, oh, it turns out I know these bandits. We used to go to Thieves Guild together. And now we have a little detail that we'll use in the story later. And, but it's back to narrative control. It's back to giving the players a little chance to throw out little things like that.
No, it's great advice. I really like that. My first instinct was to say, well, you travel by Star Wars wipe, or you travel by map, Indiana Jones style, where we just see the plane and the little red line. And those can be fine. There's especially moments in feng shui where that will be totally fine. But you can also turn it into an opportunity, like you just said, an opportunity for let the players be a little more creative. And I like that. That gives. I think that's an excellent tool. That's certainly one of the best tools I've heard that I wasn't already aware of tonight. So I think this podcast, if nothing else, has taught me at least one new trick. So
okay, well, I'm glad I was able to throw in one useful thing. I wrote about that in a little more detail on keith-baker.com a few months back, but yeah, it's something that, as I said, I've been playing with for the last year and really, really enjoy. So,
no, it sounds
and
like
it's a good
really
compromise in a game. It's a good compromise in a game too that often is more mechanic heavy. That sort of this is a place where you can give the players a little chance to play with the narrative.
Speaking of mechanics, I think that's an excellent segue into talking about combat.
Smooth segue. Ooh.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I am proud of that one. But any adventure in a role-playing game, and I'm generalizing here because there are certain role-playing games where this isn't
absolutely
true, but in general, any adventure in a role-playing game is going to involve a certain amount of action and or combat. So what are some tips and tricks that we can talk about for DMs to keep these action scenes, these combat scenes, fresh and engaging?
I've got one that I love to use for anything that's where the combat system's nice and crunchy. There's a lot going on there, like the later editions of D&D and Pathfinder and Shadowrun and games like that. I love using 3D. I love using minis in a grid, first off. The second thing is I love using 3D terrain, especially in Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition, because it adds a whole new layer to it. Especially love using the terrain as kind of almost a character itself in the combat where, okay, there's a pool of lava. Okay, there's an electrical box that you might throw an enemy into. There's a fireplace you might shove an enemy into, especially like I said, 4th edition where there's a lot of pushing and pulling. But the biggest thing I love to do is it really makes the battle pop is 3D terrain. I use dungeon tiles a lot. I also just recently, I haven't had a chance to unbox it yet, but I got those Dwarven Forge tiles from their Kickstarter. And one thing I love to do with my old D&D Dungeons and Tiles from Wizards of the Coast, the cardboard ones, is I went to the craft store and for 15 cents a pop, I bought all these little cubes that are 1-inch cubes on each side, 2-inch cubes on each side, and I painted them black, matte black, so they would kind of fade into the background a little bit, and I would put one down and then set the tile on top of it so that the minis could go up the stairs to the platform and they can push someone off or they can climb up the mountain or go up have their swashbuckling fight on the staircase and actually see the transition in altitude so they can visualize a lot better. If this is a 2-inch fall, that's 10 feet on the scale. Really easy to figure out the damage. You're not having them all the time. How big was that? How tall is that ledge again? How deep is that hole? It's right there on the screen. They can see it. It's a lot faster and it speeds things up. And like I said, it pops visually.
And I'm not going to disagree with you completely, Daryl, because you're right. Terrain is cool, and I love using it. But at the same time, I think it's important to point out that certain games just do better with allowing the players, like we've been talking about earlier, to have a little more narrative control over the area that surrounds them. And a good example for this is feng shui, which actually discourages you very strongly from using any kinds of maps or terrain, because then it's limiting what the players can decide is nearby for their stunts. Like in feng shui, if I want to play a guy who blows up a fire extinguisher, I can just say, well, I pull a fire extinguisher off the wall, and I don't have to point out to you exactly where that is on the map. I can just say I am standing next to a fire extinguisher, and therefore I pull it off the wall and throw it at a bad guy and shoot it, and it blows up.
Well, yeah, it varies by game system.
And there's also a definite halfway between those. Is between the just encouraging players to come up with anything they can think of, which works very well for players that are creative, but sometimes players off the top of their head don't think of the fact that there's probably a fireplace in the inn that they could shove someone into. Back to the other direction of having it fully mapped out is, in between, one thing I like to do a lot is to give the players a list of things that are in the scene. And not say where they are, or not say whatever, but just, for example, saying, yeah, well, in the tavern, we have a roaring fireplace, we have a plate glass window, and, we have a chandelier.
A wall full of combustible
And
alcohols.
that is not saying these are the only things there. If you can think of something else, like, well, is there a wall full of drinks? Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, there is. But, giving them a couple concrete things that they know if we use these things, we can use them for an interesting effect.
You're giving them a starting
just
point.
That sort of, right, exactly. Is just, again, I found that works really well for players who wouldn't think to just make something up on the spot. But once you say there's a roaring fireplace, they do start thinking, oh, what can I do with that?
And I'm going to back up a step. I'm actually going to talk about what Daryl said with the terrain, because it is a really cool idea. And I'm just going to throw out a tip that I've learned as a GM for making a fight really engaging, is to actually have some dynamic terrain. And what I mean by that is you have a situation that is actually going to change the terrain of the fight as you're going along. A good example is certainly. If Daryl is saying, well, there's a lava flow, okay? And the first thing I was thinking, well, okay, that's going to get bigger. That's going to escalate. So the fight is going to actually get more and more confined the longer it goes on to maybe these little islands or something. And that will really add a cool elements of action that isn't necessarily another enemy to fight. It's just another impact on the game that gives the player characters more to do, more to riff off of, and more opportunities to kind of showcase some of their unique abilities.
And it's also a way to make every single fight feel a little bit more unique, because how many times are you going to go into a 30 by 30 room and kill whatever monster's in there and go to the next one? If you add these sort of little things to each combat and swap them up, change them out, it really keeps every single encounter a little bit more fresh.
No, I agree completely. And that's sort of what it's about, is just how are you making it interesting, especially if it is essentially a fight they've done many times before. How does this one different? And I definitely like using dynamic sort of terrain effects whenever it's possible. So yeah, I agree with that.
Another thing that I really like to do is, and again, I'm going back to the games that I play the most, which is D&D and Shadowrun, but especially in D&D Pathfinder 3rd edition, even earlier editions, you can pull the same thing. If you have anything that has like a recharge ability, like Dragon's Breath, for example, according to the rules, at the start of your turn, you roll a d6. If it comes up, say like 5 or 6, they get their breath weapon back. I never do that at the start of that dragon's turn. I always do it at the end of their turn. So it'd be something like, okay, he did his claw bite, and then I roll the recharge, and then I will describe it in a way that kind of evokes the scene to them and clues them into, oh crap, this guy's about to breathe again. Like, okay, he claws and bites and this damage, blah, blah. I roll my recharge. The breath weapon recharges. Okay, you see flames from between the red dragon's sharp teeth and smoke coming from his nostrils. Your turn. So now they have a little bit of an idea, and it's a way to telegraph what might happen next and let them do some sort of planning or prepping instead of wondering, okay, well, his breath weapon might recharge in the next round. So it gives them a little bit more interaction with the scene as well, because it's like, okay, we have an idea of what's probably going to happen. He's probably going to breathe fire on us next turn, so we need to react to that. And then you can always flip it on them and say, no, I'm going to hold it off for the next turn because the dragon's smart enough to know they prepped too well. It's not going to be very effective. So he's going to fly over here and then tail whip them. And then the next turn he's going to breathe on them or something. But it's a way to...
That sort of touches on the other point of just generally giving players feedback through story rather than just concrete, he's got 10 hit points left, is, again, the fighter rolls an 18, he hits the guy for 12 hit points, rather than just being like, okay, he's hurt, or, oh, he has, 12 hit points left. Do you describe that as, oh, well, the Death Knight just easily knocks your blade aside with his shield, which may be a hit, but, he's still doing fine? Or is it, oh, your blade digs deep into his arm, but he grits his teeth and keeps going? Basically giving them an indication of, well, they know how much damage they did, but how did that impact the guy? Is he clearly hurt by it? Was it significant? Or is it just, oh, he's not even, that doesn't even bother him?
I want to make a quick point here, too. You've got an excellent discussion here about, describing the effects of the blows, and rather than just sort of, I roll, I hit, I do this much damage. And the only thing I want to point out here is, again, it kind of goes back to tone and basically empowering and protagonizing your players. It's very easy as a GM to describe things in a way that makes the player characters look stupid, especially on things like critical fumbles. And I just want to encourage DMs out there to not do that. I would instead recommend recommend that you try and describe the things that the players do as looking cool and being cool. For the most part, again, this is going to change depending on your group and depending on if they find that kind of thing really funny or not. But in my experience, most of the time, player characters want to be cool, and you can turn even a critical fumble into a moment where the villain just sort of says a one-liner or threatens their family, or just gets a chance to gloat. But it doesn't have to make the player characters look stupid, and that's all I'm saying.
I kind of agree with
I actually
that,
like
but...
to take that. I like to take that in a different direction, which is to actually, a lot of times when a fumble comes up in my game, I'll actually ask the player to describe it. And, basically say, how did you fail here? What went wrong? And so the point is, they know they failed. They know they failed badly. But how did they see that happening? What would their character have done that would have caused this to go terribly wrong? And so it doesn't let them escape the consequences of the failure, but it lets them try and phrase it in a way that makes sense to them that it could have happened to their character.
And in my games, for the tone of the games that I run, and again, your mileage may vary a lot on this one, but I think it's okay to describe what happens with their fumble as long as, like Ross was saying, you don't make them look too stupid. This isn't the Three Stooges unless you're playing Paranoia, of course, then yes, it is. But on the other hand, I always do my best to make them look cool, but I don't shy away from those moments to add a little bit of levity to it, because I think that sometimes that can be fun to add that into the game. But again, that's the tone of the games that I run. If you're running something that's really serious and grimdark, you probably don't want that in your game, because you want your characters to look badass.
So, an example that comes up in a game I just ran at a convention a little while ago was these people were going through a secret tunnel into a building, and the wizard gets a critical failure casting a fireball. And I ask him, how's that go wrong? What happened? And he says, well, I guess I probably set the tunnel on fire. And I said, yeah, that's exactly what you do. And so they got away, and that was fine. But then later they actually need to get out of the building. It's like, yeah, you're not going through that tunnel because you set it on fire. And part of the point of it to me is that if I just told him, you set the tunnel on fire, he might, feel like, I wouldn't have done that. But because, I said, well, you tell me what you did that was terribly wrong. Again, like I said, the player has to be on the page with the fact that this is a terrible failure. Something has gone wrong. But, there's room for you to at least throw out what you think it could be. And again, if the player's just like, nothing happened at all, I'd say, well, no. If you don't think of something, I will. I'm just giving you a chance to push the direction. One of my favorite ones, actually, was... it's kind of an obscure little adventure, but for reasons, the player in this case was a floating head. He was a flame skull, and
was he Morty?
He decides to. He wasn't, but exactly. That's his character, and it was the Undead A-Team, if you will, in a Karnath campaign in Eberron. And so he's a flame skull, and these people, they've basically been framed. The guards are sort of coming in to the room, and he says, well, I'm going to stay in this room to try to find out what they know, why are they chasing us. And so he says he's just going to hide on the mantelpiece. You know, he's a skull. He's just going to sit on the mantelpiece. And he rolls a 1 for his hide. I'm like, yeah, it's a pretty easy hide. You're small, you know, so go ahead and give me a stealth check. And he rolls a 1. And I'm like, okay, what went wrong? He thinks about it, and he's like, and finally says, it's the Scooby-Doo thing. You know, they walk into the room, and they're walking along, and I'm sitting there in the mantelpiece, and as they walk across the room, I just turn and follow their movement, and they all see me. And again, like I said, I could have done something bad to him, but it was because he was a participant in that, even though it ended up being bad. He at least got to have the story make sense in his mind as to how could his character have screwed this up.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. Well, on the subject of combat, I'm going to throw out something I think is really important as a DM. I'm going to say, for me, I think one of the most crucial things about running combats is pacing. I want to make sure that combat doesn't drag on forever. I want to make sure that it doesn't...
Agreed completely.
It can end abruptly. It is not. I am okay with the player characters like absolutely curb stomping my bad guys from time to time. So if it ends shortly, I'm actually okay with that most of the time. But I think it's really important as a GM to keep in mind the pacing of your game and not to let the combat totally derail it, but instead support and escalate that pacing and get it to the right place.
Well, I think that's also a matter of being sensitive to the scenario, because things can turn out differently than you thought. You thought this was going to be a really challenging, interesting fight, and it's just not turning out that way. You know, there's a whole conversation to be had of, do you fudge rolls? Do you change stats on the fly? But one of the things I'd certainly say is that don't be afraid if you've reached a point where the combat just isn't interesting and people just aren't having fun. Exactly. To summarize the ending. You know, that fine, the dragon still has 100 hit points, but it's clear, it's clear you're going to beat him. You know, let's summarize it in a short form, however you want to do that. But yeah.
I'm a very big fan of something that I haven't seen a lot of other, at least in my area, I haven't seen a lot of other DMs or GMs do. I've got no problem with the bad guys running away or surrendering when it looks like they're obviously going to lose this fight, because most kobolds and goblins and thieves and low-rent security guards aren't going to stand there and fight to the death when they're obviously outmatched. They're either going to try to lay down something they're going to do something as a distraction so they can run away, or they're just going to flat out flee, or they're going to immediately surrender and beg for their life. And that's a great way to kind of just, okay, it's, you guys have overcome any sort of challenge this presents, it's now mopping up, instead of spending another half an hour going through the motions of doing the dice rolls, and I might chip another couple of hit points off of you. These guys throw in the towel, and they either run or they surrender, and then usually when they run, they say, well, we're not going to let them get away. It's like, okay, well, you shoot your arrows, or you open up an auto fire, and you take them out.
We talked earlier about, finding a good place to set your game and you set your combat. And I think there's some great internet resources for you on that. You can actually look for, I know I searched for it with Feng Shui, 101 places to have a gunfight, and 101 places to have a sword fight, and 101 places to have a fist fight. And just, if you Google search for things like that, you will probably find some really good, especially for modern games, you will find some really good inspirations to find really unique and interesting locations to have a battle in your game.
I love tables. I love tables. I love random tables because that's how most of them are presented, but I almost never use them randomly, at least not in a roll the dice and this is what I'm forced to use. But I just love having prepped in advance a bunch of names. When I ran a Shadowrun 2nd edition game back when I was a kid, I had like an index card box full of just NPCs organized with those little note flip cards where you could just flip to, okay, I need a fixer, flip to F, okay, no, yes. And I had a bunch of, I usually keep like all sorts of little lists either on my phone or in my bag, so I can just reach out and grab it real quick. So like, I've got a list of like I think I'm up to 250 now of just random crap that the players can find in a D&D game or a Pathfinder game or any sort of fantasy game where, yeah, you're looking for treasure, but here's some other stuff that's in the room. And that gives them something that's like, oh, there's a glass jar there. That's a glass vase there. Okay, I'm going to take that glass vase and put it in my sack and crunch it up. Now I've got a bunch of glass dust I can use for something later on, maybe. So, yeah, it's, I just love those tables because it's a quick, easy way to allow you to basically pull something out of your ass if you need to.
I just want to touch back on combat for one more moment, just to the point we were making is, you said, Daryl, about the, well, we could keep this going and I could chip a couple hit points off of you, or we could, move on. One other possibility there is essentially to offer the players a deal, is to say, tell you what, if between you lose 15 more hit points, you can call it here. And, essentially to summarize it, so it's a choice to them. If they think, no, we can do better than that, we do want to fight this out and fight it to the bloody finish, then they can. But as long as someone's willing to take 15 hit points, let's move on. So just a possibility to consider is essentially a deal.
Yeah, I think as long as the player characters don't feel like they're trapped and they're forced to sit there through lots of, because the dice can just come up with some really bad runs of luck where nobody hits anything and it can kind of drag on.
And the trick to it is if the players are still having fun, let them have fun.
Right. That's what I was saying, is giving them a choice. Do you want to end it here, or do you want to see this through? And if they want to see it through, well, then fine. If they're enjoying it, then that's sort of the point. Is it's all about, are the players having fun?
Well, we're about getting close to last call here, but I just wanted to ask, I've got one or two other things I wanted to bring up, but I just wanted to go for like a general miscellaneous category for any other advice.
Sure.
One thing I would like to point out is that in my experience, players are very much monkey see, monkey do. I had an issue with my Shadowrun players where they thought they were in the Old West in every single gunfight they had. They would stand out in the middle of open and just shoot until everything was dead, which is, there's a lot of rules built into Shadowrun to discourage that, zigzagging, running, and taking cover. And they just wouldn't do it. So one time I put them up against these weenie security guards that were obviously not a match for this team. And so I'm like, okay, I'm going to show you what happens why you should be doing this. And I had these little runty things, run and take cover, and the players immediately within one turn noticed all the penalties they were getting to hit that the NPCs were not. And within the next turn, they were taking cover, they were doing zigzags, they were throwing smoke grenades, they were doing it. So if there's something that you kind of want the players to do, but you don't want to just go, hey guys, if you do this, it'd be better for you overall, because you don't want to dictate their actions to them, but
Absolutely.
If you show them the effectiveness of something, they'll do it.
That's not a bad technique, Daryl.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense.
I had one other little tip I wanted to drop in. As a DM, if you need a break to think for a moment, I'm going to tell you right now, your best thing ever in a D&D game. You enter a room that's 25 feet by 25 feet. Directly across the door from the door you just opened is another door. Each tile is a different colored stone in a checkerboard pattern. What do? You've just bought yourself 10 minutes minimum where they will be looking for that trap, because they know it's there. Now, that only work once or twice.
One interesting thing to flip around on that I'll just know from the Dread campaign I was in, one thing they did there was actually set a timer on player discussion, because there what they concretely wanted was to give the sense that this is an action movie, if you will. And so they would present a situation like that and say, essentially, the walls are closing in. Okay, you have, tick 2 minutes to figure out what you're about to do. Just because, as you said, well, players could spend 20 minutes discussing how they want to approach this.
Oh, I bought myself 45 minutes one time doing that trick.
Yeah, and I'm just saying, if you specifically want a mood of pressure, which again, most games you don't, but if you do, that's one thing to do, is to actually let the players know. And, basically if the timer runs out, then the walls are crushing you, sort of thing. So, just a thing to think about. Overall, I think my whole thing walking away from this, is just the whole know your players, work with your players. This isn't something that's about you doing it alone. It's about you all having a good time together. And whether that's just you understanding what your players enjoy, or whether that's you actively involving your players in the narrative. To me, the thing about being a good game master is make sure you are working with your players instead of against them.
And that's a good point. I'm going to jump on the bandwagon of one last thing. For me, one last thing I would say to GMs, and this is a lesson that I learned definitely from a very good group of role players, is sometimes the best thing you can do as a GM is shut up and sit back. And what that means is there's often going to be times, if you have a really good group and they really like role-playing and they want to sort of discuss things, they want to plan their upcoming Shadowrun, or if they want to try and hash out who the real bad guy is, or they want to figure out what the end of the mystery is, sometimes the best thing you can do as a GM is just let them talk. You don't need to always be involved. You don't need to always rush things ahead. If you feel like they're all having a good time,
absolutely.
and this is what they came to do, is to roleplay and be in character, and if you feel like that's really something that they're getting a lot out of, just talking to each other, let it happen. Don't be afraid to just be quiet for a while.
No, absolutely. I mean, despite having mentioned that timer thing, which I just mentioned as a sort of random interesting thing that came up,
and it is interesting.
I completely agree. The point is, if the players are enjoying themselves, let them go. And one other thing I'll just bounce off of that is I had a game master once who basically always felt that he had to make things difficult. And by that I mean, okay, we're just trying to break a guy out of essentially local county jail, and we're expert thieves, and we come up with a great plan. You don't necessarily have to make it, but what do you know? The Royal Guard happened to be stopping in. You don't have to throw in things. Sometimes it is good to let the players, if they come up with a great plan, let them feel like they're awesome. Like, that was a brilliant plan. It works. If you see what I'm saying, you don't always have to be trying to trip them up or challenge them. Sometimes it's okay to let the players, succeed. If they're being smart about what they're doing, let them enjoy that.
And there's a flip side to that, where if you have an NPC that's obviously going to be smarter and more brilliant and more thorough in their planning than you are, like if you have Ancient Dragon or a Lich or something like that, do you not feel any problems whatsoever? If the PCs do something that pulls something that you could not have foreseen, that just completely disrupts their plans, feel free to take a moment and say, okay, hang on, I'm going to try to figure out if they would have planned for that. Now, don't be a dick and just try to come up with something to destroy their plan. If it's a good plan, what you're thinking of is, would this NPC have foreseen what they would have done, and how would he have said something to a plan or a contingency for this? Don't be a dick about it and just to try to screw them over. If they came up with a good plan, let them have a good plan, but feel free to take a moment and take a step back and say, okay, I wasn't smart enough to do this, but I'm also not 1,500 years old, and a master spellcaster, so.
Yeah, that's something a point I concretely made actually with the Lords of Dust in Eberron. Is in an article I wrote about them, I actually specifically say they are the villain I will cheat with, because yes, they have calculated everything out, and they do have prophetic knowledge, and they are a point where I may say, oh yeah, they knew you were going to do that, blah blah blah. But, that's part of what distinguishes them as a villain. As you say, it's when you're playing a villain who's smarter than you.
Okay, guys, we are way past last call right now, so we're going to go ahead and wrap up real quick. Keith, do you want to tell us a little bit more about what you're working on again for the audience, and let us know where they can find you on the interwebs?
Okay, so I can be found at keith-baker.com. I am also on Twitter as HellCowKeith, all one word. Currently, I am working on some more Gloom things. I'm working on a new role-playing game called Phoenix, which I talk about on my website, and will be crowdfunding early 2014. And I also do regular Eberron Q&As every couple of weeks on my website.
I think there's been two in the past week or two, I think.
Well, the last week, the question came up that I was just like, oh, that's a good thing to explore. So that's been unusual. But yes, I try to at least do one every couple weeks. So, and that's where you can find me.
Thank you very much, Keith. I think Daryl and I have been very, very grateful to have you on the show. It's been wonderful talking about DM stuff with you, and we'd love to have you back in the future at some point.
Thanks. I would love to come back, especially once Phoenix is out, so I can talk more concretely about that.
All right.
And that wraps things up for episode 9 of the Gamers Tavern. I'd like to once again thank our guest Keith Baker for taking the time out of his very busy schedule and being with us tonight. I know it sounds like we got a little heated there talking about villains, but I consider Keith a friend, and it was great to debate with him. And even if I disagreed with him a little bit, I did learn a lot from him, and hopefully you learned a lot as well. If you have a tip for running your games, or if you want to weigh in on anything that we said, please visit gamerstavern.org and leave us a comment. Your comment might just be read on air. And if you want to support the show, please visit our site and check out our sponsors. You can also like us on Facebook at facebook.com/gamerstavern, or follow us on Twitter at meetinatavern, or you can rate and review us on iTunes. Next week, next week, we really hit something that come on guys, I write for Cool News. The topic is the influence of television and film on gaming, and how gaming has influenced television and film. I talk a lot. Anyway, I do give plenty of time to our guests, both game designer Mac Martin and Alan Kearney, aka Nordling, my editor over at Cool News. So, yeah, I'm kind of on my best behavior. The Gamers Tavern is distributed under a Creative Commons, non-commercial, no derivatives license. The theme to Gamers Tavern is copyright 2013 Daryl Mott Jr., all rights reserved. Until next time, gamers, the tavern is closed.